What's going on, everybody? Welcome back. Here I'm going to be looking at the game versus Leicester and Chelsea in the FA Cup final, where Leicester ended up winning 1-0. So before we start, a few things. Check out my book. It is out. There's a link in the description below. And check out Modern Soccer Coach, the YouTube channel. I'm going to be going on the podcast next week. Super excited about it. So be sure to check out that channel and be on the lookout for the podcast. I'll be on it and I'm super excited about it. So this is made using Keyframe like usual, and there's a link in the description below as well as to my book. But let's get right into it. So we're going to go with Chelsea in the build-up phase first. And first off, with Chelsea in possession of the ball, they went with their back three, as they usually do under Thomas Tuchel, with Jorginho and then Conte further up the field, as he had a more vertical mobility using his athleticism and his ability to cover ground in the right half space and overload the space between the lines. And then, as always, in the first third of the field, we would typically see Azpilicueta go into the wider area, and then Thiago Silva drop to the right-hand side of Kepa, utilizing his right foot and just making it more natural for Thiago Silva playing in this deeper role as the central defender. And now for Leicester, how they counteract this and look to null the Chelsea attack. We first saw them play a 5-2-3 or a 5-3-2, and this was pretty much dependent on Iosi Perez, as he typically started off as a left midfielder, but he had the ability to jump to Azpilicueta and join Vardy and Iheanacho in the first line of pressure, which left Tielemans and Ndidi to then cover the two holding midfielders of Chelsea, which then gave them more man orientation in their defensive line. Moving forward now, in the midfield third, we can clearly see Iosi Perez jumping to then join the first line of pressure of the two forwards, Iheanacho and Jamie Vardy. And then their task would then be to press the first line using their cover shadow to block the half space and really increase the amount of pressure in the first line of passing of Chelsea and increase the pressure in the mutual help space. So the mutual help space, of course, typically you can think of this as the first line passing options. So in this case, it would be Thiago Silva, Jorginho, Mason Mount, and then Reece James in the wide area, or Reece James on the ball, so it would be Azpilicueta in the wide area. So moving forward now, the holding midfielders for Leicester typically jump towards the holding midfielders of Chelsea, but also playing a little bit between, staggering themselves between the offensive midfielders and the holding midfielders, creating slightly dual roles so that their central defenders behind them don't have to jump too early and expose themselves with a higher line than they need to. But at the same time, Chelsea look to use their numerical advantage in the center to then play through the central corridors and find players like Mason Mount and Hakim Ziyech in between the lines, exposing the two holding midfielders of Leicester, especially when Iosi Perez would jump and open up options between the lines and advanced areas. And when Leicester would defend deeper against Chelsea, they played with a clear back five, as they did throughout the whole game and throughout each third of the field. But the key difference in their low block was their horizontal compactness and the distances between their midfielders. So what I mean by this is the distances between their central midfield three increased and their connections became stretched. But this wasn't such a big deal because their back five or their three central defenders were then there to cover this space between the lines. So if a player were to appear in this position, like Hakim Ziyech, the central defender would jump and cover the blind spot of these three midfielders, whereas these three midfielders would then cover the distances between defenders using their cover shadow. And going forward, we see Kelechi Iheanacho playing as the deeper forward, here closer to the ball as a more immediate outlet, and Jamie Vardy playing higher, stretching the back line and threatening for a more direct pass to take advantage of Chelsea's rest defense. So they played a 5-3-1-1. Moving towards Leicester in possession here, where they played with a back three in the first line of build-up, and they showed a little bit of asymmetry with Sancho and Fofana going into the wider areas, typically when they're in structured possession, and then creating a four-man midfield shape similar to as Chelsea do, but they do it a little bit differently, with Iheanacho dropping into the right half space from a higher position, then getting Rudiger to jump, thus creating space in behind for Jamie Vardy to make runs into. Ayoze Perez jumps from his deeper midfield position in the defensive phase to then get between the lines and look for an advanced area pass to then break the defense. Chelsea, on the other hand, often saw Conte jumping forward, leaving Jorginho as a single pivot. Then Jorginho would typically be responsible for the weak side, so his defensive 1v1 abilities wouldn't be as exposed enough, leaving Rudiger to then jump and defend Kelechi Iheanacho. Chelsea would then typically use man orientation to control the double pivot and see Ziyech again forming the vertical partnership with Conte to jump to press the first line with Timo Werner as well. And here we can just see the midfield shape and how it interacts with Jamie Vardy in the last line of their offensive structure. So we see here Jamie Vardy looking to get between the lines, stretch the defense of Chelsea, creating space vertically for advanced players of Leicester. But Chelsea and their three central defenders typically have the +1 superiority because of Rudiger jumping and then having two central defenders to then block Jamie Vardy's runs and limit his influence on the game. In the first third of the field, Leicester used some rotations and some staggering to create asymmetry, still going with their back three, but then now Fofana comes into the wider position as more of a fullback role, releasing the wingback to go higher up the field and sticking with the 3-2 build-up shape. Now the next two pictures will look a little bit differently, but first we'll take a look at the asymmetry using the half space and wide areas and avoiding the central area, which is a little bit interesting. Typically when we see teams in the first line of build-up, they like to use asymmetry to access each of these vertical corridors. So Fofana is in the wide area, the most central defender is then positioned in the half space, and then Sancho is on the weak side in the wide area as well. And this is pretty much to undo the horizontal connections of Chelsea and try to progress around the Chelsea block. So now this is a clip I put together to show the full offensive structure of Leicester as much as I possibly could without making it too confusing, but let's map it out. So we have our back three here, and these are just a few seconds apart, so it shouldn't be too off. We have our Chelsea front three here to match up man for man against Leicester's first line typically, but with Mason Mount, his versatility in the defensive phase puts him in a unique position to then cover both in the first line and the second line of pressure with Conte. Jorginho dropping to the weak side, using his cover shadow to block Ayoze Perez, limiting his responsibility in the defensive phase. We have then our double pivot of Leicester and Iheanacho dropping deeper, occupying an advanced area with Ayoze Perez on the weak side, creating a 3-4 build-up, and with the wingbacks holding width and Jamie Vardy stretching in behind. Now the last picture to show full circle the Leicester shape, we see Fofana go into the wide area, our central defender come alongside Schmeichel, our double pivot, and then our width being created by the advanced wingback, Kelechi Iheanacho starting higher to then come deeper, Jamie Vardy playing through the center, stretching the Chelsea back line, and then we have Ayoze Perez in the left-sided half space, whereas Chelsea, they have Timo Werner and Hakim Ziyech in the first line looking to press the Leicester City first line of build-up. We have N'Golo Kante and Mason Mount, and then with Jorginho as the lone holding midfielder to block entry passes in behind the two holding midfielders of Chelsea. And that's the analysis, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.